Let's talk noble heroes, red thirst, and the death visions of a dying Primarch, with an overview of the Blood Angels army in Warhammer 40K. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking about the Sons of Sanguinius in full, and we're going to be going through their army bit by bit, seeing what works in the current game of Warhammer 40k, and how the Blood Angels are doing in general. In the video we'll talk through how the Blood Angels are getting on right now, some of their core rules with their chapter tactics and combat doctrine, look at the Sanguinary Guard Death Company and the various other unique units that they can field in game, some of the strongest supporting rules within the Codex, and round up with some talk about missions and some strong army lists. Loads to talk about, so strap your jump pack on and let's bounce straight forward. First up, Blood Angels were pretty strong for Space Marines in Warzone Nephilim, the previous Grand Tournament pack. Perhaps not stand out within Warhammer 40k in general, but a win rate of around about 47%, taking home a few decent tournaments, and perhaps doing a fair bit better than most of their Space Marine peers. They've got some pretty massive melee power with their +1 to wound when they charge in, good speed with all their jump pack units, though perhaps are a chapter that have been heavily carried by their Sanguinary Guard for really quite a long time now, being pretty dependent on that one singular datasheet to do a lot of the heavy lifting. Occasionally they can perhaps just be a little bit monodimensional. The main game is to get the violent guys with the jump packs into combat in one form or another. The core of a fair few competitive lists do tend to be fairly similar, though you can take the army in some different and fun ways. They are generally pretty dynamic to play on the table with their fast movement and hard-hitting melee power. Unfortunately for them, in Arks of Omen, the rules changes really haven't helped them quite as much as their brother Space Marines. For the most part, the changes were a story of losing Armour of Contempt but getting some good points buffs and a few other rules to counteract it. Unfortunately for Blood Angels, it seems like they maybe got the short end of the stick there. Two of their best units, the Sanguinary Guard and the Death Company, really liked Armour of Contempt. They don't get any invul saves, and it does make that entire section of the army just massively easier to kill for lower AP weapons. I'm not sure the big Inferno pistol handout really was quite enough to compensate. They did get a few helpful points cuts, including things like the struggling Bar Predator, but in general I'd argue that a fair few of the datasheets throughout Codex Space Marines that got better are perhaps stronger run in other chapters, say Terminators in Dark Angel's Deathwing, or various heavy options in Iron Hands. For whatever reason, in the first few weeks of tournament results in Arks of Omen, Blood Angels haven't been doing particularly well. A 45% win rate overall, which is on the lower end of 40k for sure. It seems like they might be doing a little bit worse than they were previously before the updates. They have won a couple of big events in Arks of Omen already and have placed quite high in other things. It might be that they're just an army that's quite good when you master them, but maybe aren't as easy to play at a more casual level. Still though, they definitely have potential to have good success. Jumping into their actual rules though, I think quite a lot of Blood Angel strength comes from their chapter tactic. Red Thirst gives them +1 to wound in the first round of melee, and also +1 to advance and charge. It's nice and simple, massive extra damage, and a big boost to getting them there. The +1 to wound is perhaps more meaningful on things with mid to low strength weapons. Strength 4 and 5 things really like it, where it's maybe not quite as hugely important on things like Power Fists, which might have already been wounding on 2s anyway. The +1 advance and charge is very nice to have just all over. It won't always make the difference between whether you make a charge or don't do, but the times that it do, that's going to be absolutely massive. It'll be the difference between a crazy amount of very strong melee attacks or none at all. They've got a bigger on-the-board threat range, and if you do choose to deep strike anything, then you've got a better than average chance of getting a unit in combat if you can budget a CP reroll if you fail. It's a 42% chance if you don't reroll, and a 66% chance if you do. Definitely not reliable, but a better chance than most. Compared with some chapters like Space Wolves for example, people don't tend to run Flesh Terrors or Successors quite as much for Blood Angels. I think that's largely due to a big part of the chapter's strength being from that chapter tactic. You definitely don't want to be giving up that +1 to wound, that's amazing. Flesh Terrors swap out the extra +1 to advance and charge bit for extra AP on 6s, which is a small melee damage boost, but often it's going to be a little bit on the underwhelming side. In general, people tend to see it as being a lot more valuable to have that extra advance and charge, plus access to the Blood Angels' bigger roster of unique characters. Some of them are quite good, like Dante and Lamatis, for example. If you were running Flesh Terrors, I'd probably take Gabriel Seth though. He's got some pretty mad melee for the cost. Then, to back up that chapter tactic, the Blood Angels have got their unique assault doctrine called Savage Echoes. This one gives you +1 attack in the first round of melee when you charged, were charged, or made a heroic intervention. And of course that's on top of the extra AP-1 that you get for being an Assault Doctrine in the first place. It really is a pretty nice and fairly universal buff, great for just about any Blood Angels infantry, a little bit less overwhelming on characters perhaps. For most infantry units it equates to around about 25% or 33% melee damage boost, and it's perhaps a little bit more valuable on things with a small number of high value attacks, things like Power Fists or Thunderhammers. When you get to Assault Doctrine, you are going to be rolling a whole load of dice, and often quite good quality ones if you're running Sanguinary Guard and things, and it's quite possible to get access to this early, usually with a Sanguinary Priest to put a unit into Assault Doctrine in one of the first couple of turns. That is usually an option that a lot of lists tend to take advantage of. Overall, the Blood Angels move quite quickly and hit you very, very hard, particularly when you get to turn 3 onwards. Looking at their units, I thought it probably made sense to start off with perhaps the scariest unit that they have to offer, the Sanguinary Guard. These guys are an elite's choice for 30 points and just have all manner of good things going for them. They're jump infantry with a 3 attack base profile and a 2+ save. That's mean 4 attacks on the charge with Shock Assault and 5 with Savage Echoes. Games Workshop made all of their war gear free, so I think usually now it makes more sense to equip them with Inferno pistols for the mini melter shot right up close. That could absolutely wreck a tank if you can get close to one. And then your choice of the 3 different flavours of power weapon that they can have, either uncommon swords or uncommon axes, mid-strength, mid-AP and damage 2 weapons, or power fists that give you -1 to hits but big strength. I think there's arguments that you could make for all 3 of those. I prefer the sword overall as the all-rounder, but a fair few people like to mix in fists and axes as well. That's already really quite a nice profile to build around for 30 points, but on top of that they get a whole bunch of other stuff. Angelic Visage for a -1 to hit in close combats doesn't hurt. Their Heirs of Azkalion special rule gives them a +1 to hit near a Blood Angel's Warlord, so that means that if that's a captain you could be hitting on 2s re-rolling 1s with all of these scary attacks. And on top of that they've got a stratagem called Unbridled Ardour, which allows you to heroic intervention 6 inches for 1 command point, meaning that your opponent can't really safely go anywhere near them, even in their turn. It means that they can be quite nice for defending objectives. If the opponent can't clear them, they're not going to be able to just obset the objective away without you having to step up and jump into combat with them. Overall, a pretty great unit. Just for an example of what they can achieve with a bit of support, here's 5 Sanguinary Guard with swords for 150 points. They're an Assault Doctrine next to a Captain or Chapter Master Warlord for their hitting on 2s and re-rolling 1s. That gives you 25 attacks with that, with Strength 5 and +1 to wound, AP -4 because of Assault Doctrine, and damage 2. That little lot will put 20 Guardsmen or Space Marines to the sword, absolutely the same. They kill 7 Terminators on average, 24 wounds to a toughness 7 or 8 vehicle, though they fall down a little bit against harder targets. It's only 8 wounds to a toughness 8 vehicle with a 5+ invul and -1 damage, though that's still not too bad. To be fair, for tougher stuff, if you can get them very close before they get to charge, you get 5 melter shots from Inferno pistols. If you can get them in close to something else and then charge a different target, you could potentially be wrecking a tank or big vehicle before they even charge. The pistol shots either average you 11 or 18 wounds to a toughness 7 vehicle, depending on whether you can get them super close and within 3-inch range. Overall, it's pretty scary stuff. A lot of competitive lists tend to take a fairly ridiculous amount of these, often 3 decently sized units, often building out above the normal 5. That's not the only scary jump pack infantry that Blood Angels can field though. They can also take Death Company, 20 points per model, and I definitely give them a jump pack for the extra 3 points so they can be hurtling towards the enemy as well. They're not quite as tough, just 2 wounds with a 3+ save, though they do get a Feel No Pain from Black Rage. They'll typically be getting 4 attacks on the charge as well, with Black Rage plus Shock Assault, maybe 5 if they get the Savage Echoes as well. And they've got a fair choice of war gear, all of which is fairly viable as well. Thunderhammers, Power Fists, or power weapons of various flavours. The Thunderhammers cost +10 points, the Power Fists +5, and the other power weapons, they're free. If you're not taking Thunderhammers, you can also mix in Inferno pistols there. They're also free and can give the squad some surprising anti-tank punch. They do get a couple of downsides in they've got actually fairly low leadership, they can't do actions and they can't fall back, but they are fairly monstrously dangerous for their points cost. And they've got a couple of nice stratagems as well. Forlorn Fury to allow you to pre-game move them, so you could very easily set up for a first turn charge with a scary unit of them. And Refusal to Die is also 1 CP for a squad of 5. That's the one where they can flex into a 5+ Feel No Pain. Could be worth it for the extra toughness if you need it. I think the first way that I'd be looking to use Death Company would usually be to threaten that Forlorn Fury strike and just break something scary in the middle of the enemy army right from the get-go. This is for a squad with 5 hammers and jump packs for 165 points, 1 command point to pre-game move them 12 inches to near guarantee them that first turn charge. Ideally chain the models back towards Dante or a Chapter Master plus a Sanguinary Priest in the main ranks of the army, and then in your first turn throw out the Assault Doctrine and 4 rerolls on the unit to make them monstrously dangerous. If you do manage to get that combo off, then the squad will be looking at 25 attacks at Strength 8, AP 3 and Damage 3, hitting on a 4 plus re-rolling and plus 1 to wounds. That'd average you 13 dead Marines, 10 dead Terminators, a spectacularly stupid 39 wounds to a Toughness 7 vehicle, and 14 wounds to that hard target from earlier. They certainly have the potential to break things like an Imperial Knight's turn 1 if they can reach it. They are a crazily scary threat to have on the table, though they do have a couple of counters like being screened out by enemy pre-game movers or forward deploy units, and potentially they could actually be quite wary of Overwatch if they are charging something really significant. Still though, just because of Forlorn Fury, I could see a single unit of Death Company being pretty popular in the vast majority of Blood Angels lists. You could definitely feel more if you wanted though. Next up for important units, I thought we'd talk about some of the very strongest characters. Sanguinary Priests are the apothecaries that can unleash the rage of their fellow battle brothers. Apothecaries have generally been pretty good throughout 9th edition so far, resurrecting slain Space Marines, but these guys can take it to the next level by also putting a squad into the Assault Doctrine each turn as well, plus they also get the option of taking a jump pack, which I would definitely take, to actually get all that healing and damage buffs where it needs to be, ideally alongside some squads of Sanguinary Guard charging in, I guess. They're quite a good place to put Warlord traits and relics that you might want for them. They're not bad to carry things like the Rites of War potentially, or maybe upgrade them to the Chief Apothecary with Selfless Healer, and if you wanted a bit of melee damage out of them, you could give them the Teeth of Terror. They do get a chainsword, so that could make them significantly more dangerous in combat. Dante himself is another very common pick in competitive lists. The old Chapter Master of the Blood Angels at 165 points in game has a fairly impressive stat line with 6 wounds and 6 attacks, and strikes with a damage to Axe Mortalis, plus his Inferno pistol. Again, he's just generally all-round efficient, I think. The Chapter Master rerolls I think are really quite big for the Blood Angels, being able to throw those onto a squad before charging them up the board. It means that he can buff units even when he isn't directly standing right next to them, as they might go different ways later in the turn. And then he throws in a few other things that really help out, things like getting an additional command point if you're the Warlord, which is quite nice and adds to his value. Plus he can do a 0 command point epic deed stratagem, perhaps fighting in death if he's slain. Another common support character for jump pack units is the Sanguinary Ancient. He's 110 points, and maybe doesn't really have all that impressive a stat line, a slightly jumped up Sanguinary Guard who could take an Oncarmin sword. He tends to be quite a popular choice in lists though for a couple of different reasons. You can have one unit get a +1 to hit. The fights in death thing can be potentially helpful, but I feel like the real draw to him is taking the Wrath of Baal relic that only he can take. That's one that gives you an aura of +2-inch movement to your jump pack units, giving them a pretty fearsome threat range with 14-inch movement. It might not sound like a lot, but that could certainly propel you to be able to charge units that otherwise would have just been a bit too far away realistically. Finally, for another one of the unique characters that I think again is really quite fun is Chaplain Lamates. He's 120 points, and he's perhaps the dedicated chaplain you might want to bring along if you're taking Death Company, giving you a couple of different litanies that only affect them, as well as being generally dangerous in combat with that Blood Crosius, and giving nearby Death Company things like re-rolling charge rolls and using his leadership, which is pretty useful seeing as they only have leadership 7. I think he is quite efficient, though it's maybe a bit dependent on taking large numbers of Death Company for him to buff. Otherwise, for different unique units in the Blood Angels Codex, the Furioso and Death Company Dreadnoughts are interesting enough, 120 points for the fighty guys with the Blood Talons. Their combat stats really aren't too bad, but they're slightly slow and harder to deliver compared with other combat units, and people don't tend to take them an enormous amount. They did get a bit of free gear in the Arks of Omen points update, but not enough to make a difference to them, I think. The Baal Predator though, I think they might have actually put it in a position where it's really not too bad. 110 points for the assault cannons and heavy bolter loadout would probably be the way that I'd go, and he can also take a storm bolter and hunter killer missile launcher for free as well. It did get a pretty crazy points drop recently, going all the way down to 110 from 150. If you want a bit of anti-infantry, it's really not bad, though it will still struggle against heavies somewhat. I guess its main issue is that it just doesn't really have all that much synergy with the Blood Angel's assault options that you usually want to take, and all of those AP-1 shots will be a lot better in Devastator Doctrine, where I feel like a lot of Blood Angels lists are generally going to want to progress towards Assault Doctrine. Still though, I think it's kind of interesting on paper. A trio of these is now only 330 points, and would spam out an awful lot of AP-1 shots. The Death Company Intercessors are only 18 points as well, and again are kinda interesting. They basically get the equipment of regular or assault intercessors, but get Black Rage for the extra attack and the 6+ feel no pain. I feel like they're often a unit that just kinda gets overlooked though as a bit of an awkward middle ground. They don't really get the serious high power weaponry to be able to take out enemy heavies particularly efficiently. They don't get objectives secured like troops do, and they aren't particularly fast like say assault marines are. Even though their raw numbers really aren't too bad, it does just mean that they'll often be struggling for a place within the army, though I feel like a unit or two really isn't going to do you the most harm. Finally, the Blood Angels do have a fairly extensive cast of characters. As mentioned, I feel like probably Dante and the Sanguinary Priest and Ancient are maybe the pick of the bunch of the unique ones, but plenty of the others are kinda interesting in their own way. Mephiston and the Furioso Librarian Dreadnought I feel generally compete for a role. Despite being infantry and vehicle, they have fairly similar profiles in terms of the damage that they do and the defensive profiles they have. Currently with these points cost though, I would say that Mephiston wins overall. He seems like a fair target for using things like Quickening and Wings of Sanguinius to zoom around the battlefield pretty quick. Tycho for a unique captain I think is just pretty underwhelming for 95 points, doesn't really have a decent melee weapon, though his combi melter isn't terrible. Astorath's a fun unique jump chaplain, maybe a rival of Lamarti's perhaps. He's a bit more general purpose and can use things on different units, plus he has his own unique litany. Brother Corbulo is a sanguinary priest on foot for 115 points, gives you an aura of an assault doctrine, so could be interesting if you're running really quite a lot of Blood Angels foot sloggers. If you are building around their iconic jump infantry though, he might struggle to keep up, and probably isn't worth it over the jump pack sanguinary priest. The Sanguinor's 150 points and isn't a terrible combatant with some interesting heroic intervention type rules. His buffs really aren't amazing though, and for the most part I'd just rather have Dante over him. And he can make a couple of units Death Company characters. They are maybe a bit niche though, and they're only really relevant if you want a captain or lieutenant to lead a bunch of Death Company into battle. In general, I'd be more tempted to build around the Sanguinary Guard at the moment, but I guess if Death Company ever get good, then these guys will look a bit more attractive. You can make a fairly convincing Smash Captain from them, I suppose. Overall, I'd say the vast majority of the Blood Angels' unique stuff is at least fairly usable, besides the stuff that I think is really good that we covered individually, maybe the Baal Predator. The Death Company Intercessors, Mephiston and Astorath are perhaps my favourite out of this list. Aside from units, the Blood Angels have a fair amount of decent Codex support rules as well. For Warlord traits, often quite a popular one is Soul Warden. That one gives you a 6-inch aura of a 5+ save against mortal wounds. They're really quite common in Warhammer 40K these days, so it's not a bad thing to have in the lines. The good standard Space Marine ones like Rites of War for Obsec, Selfless Healer for Sanguinary Priests, Resurrecting Models, and Wise Orator for Chaplains is quite nice as well, making their litanies cast on a 2+. If you do want to go with slightly old school Blood Angel Smash characters, then I really like Gift of Foresight for that one. Each turn you get to reroll one hit roll, wound roll, and save. In terms of raw damage and defense gained, it's pretty impressive to be honest, particularly if that save was a big multi-damage attack, or you're striking with a weapon where you're really going to feel the hits and wound rolls. On the Relics front, the Visage of Death is kind of an interesting one. That one strips enemy objectives secured within 6 inches and also makes the bearer -1 to hit. Pretty interesting that you can have that on the same model that you get Rites of War with the Warlord trait, so you could have a model that's both objective secured and removes enemy obsec. So basically, while this model's alive and on an objective, it is yours, pretty much no questions asked. The Wrath of Baal is the relic that you can give the Sanguinary Ancient for an aura of +2 inches to your movement for nearby jump infantry, increases the range of Sanguinary Guard and Vanguard veterans and things by a decent chunk. The Teeth of Terror from the main Space Marine Codex is pretty popular as well. Mass Strength 5 damage to attacks works pretty well with +1 to wound, plus it's a particularly good one for that Sanguinary Priest who can't take other fancy power weapons to make him into a melee powerhouse all of his own. They'd probably be my first picks out of the relic list, but otherwise the Hammer of Baal isn't terrible as a big scary thunder hammer, the Icon of the Angel for some reroll charges, the Quake Bolts for some melee damage boost against one marked unit, or perhaps the Vox Spiritum on a Sanguinary Priest for bigger range on his aura. Next up, we've got the psychic powers. I'd say for Blood Angels, they're maybe not super standout, definitely usable in a couple of combinations, but not necessarily something that I'd say is strong enough to make librarians an auto-include, which they might kind of be for other chapters. Generally, I'd probably run them either as the buffing combo or the melee monster kind of combo. For the buffing ones, you can get exploding sixes from Unleash Rage, really scary when you've already got a souped up unit in Assault Doctrine from a Sanguinary Priest perhaps. And also you can hand out a 5+ Invul to 1 unit from Shield of Sanguinius. That one's more relevant than ever given Armour of Contempt going away. Both of those could be pretty nasty when say applied to something like a unit of Death Company with Thunderhammers, far more dangerous and also far tougher. Otherwise, for units like Mephiston or the Furioso Librarian Dreadnought, you could maybe take the combo of Quickening and Wings of Sanguinius. Quickening is one that gives the Psyker themselves an extra D3 extra attacks, plus rerolling advances and charges. Wings of Sanguinius gives you a 12-inch move and fly, and you also get to move once more, so that's a potential 18-inch move in a single turn, jumping across the battlefield to smash something in combat. It is kind of funny that you could have a Dreadnought winging across the battlefield and charge something a really long way away, but it can be a bit annoying to have a big part of your movements locked to Psychic though. Some armies are rather good at denying them. Otherwise they could always fall back on Smite of course, and if you didn't really particularly care for any of these powers, you could always take Blood Boil as a sort of sniping witchfire that isn't too bad. Stratagems next. I generally wouldn't consider the Blood Angel stratagems perhaps the single most useful ones out of any of the Space Marine codexes, but they do have a few interesting options. We already mentioned Unbridled Ardour for the heroic intervention on Sanguinary Guard. That's really big. The Death Company ones are both pretty usable as well, particularly for a squad of 5 or less where they only cost 1 command point. The pre-game move for Forlorn Fury is nice, as is the 5+ Feel No Pain for refusal to die if you think it's going to make a difference. For another unit specific one, 1 command point would give you Chalice Overflowing. This is the one that allows your Sanguinary Priest to use their buff on another unit nearby within 6 inches. Extra AP and an extra attack from Savage Echoes could easily be worth 1 command point if it is a unit that's just going to get engaged with the enemy. Otherwise, for an interesting utility one, you could use Angel's Sacrifice. That's one where you have a character basically throw themselves in the way of the enemy's attacks. The enemy must attack that character with everything that they have if they're in combat with them. So you could have a character just tank all of, say, a Demon Primarch's damage, and the Demon Primarch wouldn't be able to throw any of their attacks towards the squad of Sanguinary Guard, for example, that's also in combat with them. Usually it is going to be sacrificing a character to do that, but if it's the choice between getting them killed and also a squad killed as well, it might well be worth it. Otherwise, On Wings of Fire is nice, 1 command point for a jump unit to return to reserves. That one's maybe most useful if you happen to be in combat with an enemy unit in a fight that you don't think that you're going to win. It often could be better having a lone Sanguinary Guard or Vanguard Veteran or something re-emerge later in the game and do something important like an objective, as opposed to waiting for the combat phase where the opponent might well just kill them first. I guess it's interesting enough as well that you could use that as a way to kind of fall back Death Company, even though they usually can't. Finally, for a couple of damage dealers, there's a +1 to hit from Descent of Angels, coming from Deep Strike reserved for a jump pack unit, and you get +1 to hit at range and in combat. It's a bit annoying that you have to commit to this before you've made the charge. The +1 to hit in combat really isn't all that useful if you don't know if you're even going to make it, but I guess it's particularly useful for things like Inceptors with their Plasma or their Bolters. Finally, Red Rampage for 1 command point can give your army a little bit of AP army-wide. In the Assault Doctrine, all of your melee weapons gain a pip of AP on a wound roll of 6. It is quite nice to have this literally army-wide, could be helpful against very high save foes, but against a lot of targets it might not matter all that much. Overall, I'd say it's perhaps not the most exciting stratagem section out of most codexes. Perhaps Unbridled Ardour and Forlorn Fury are maybe the most game-changing if and when they matter, and I could see Chalice Overflowing, Upon Wings of Fire, and maybe Angel's Sacrifice being interesting utility ones as the game goes on. Looking outside the Blood Angel supplement now, let's talk about a few other strong units from Codex Space Marines that maybe have a bit more relevance to Blood Angels than most. For the troop section, I feel like the Blood Angels just generally get on well with the various flavours of Primaris troops. They all have at least a few attacks, which get pretty scary when you have the +1 to wound and extra attacks and AP in the Assault Doctrine. Even the basic squad can be pretty punchy. Infiltrators seem to be all the rage for Space Marine lists these days, with their big deep strike denial and the Helix gauntlets to ignore failed saves. though I think incursors are maybe a bit more relevant for Blood Angels than most. Getting a little bit of AP on their attacks is great with their combat buffs. Both the regular and the assault intercessors are very nice as well. Blood Angels intercessor sergeants with thunder hammers are pretty terrifying. And for other units that could be interesting for objective work, eliminators in the heavy support slot and scouts in the elite slot could also be useful for that too in their own ways. I think mixing in a little bit of fire support still isn't the worst with Blood Angels. I feel like in general you want to keep the majority of the army somewhat combat focused, as otherwise you might as well be playing another chapter. But maybe dedicating somewhere around 100 to 400 odd points of a 2000 point army list to fire support could be worse. Some things are just legitimately easier to kill with shooting than combat. I feel like a trio of Eradicators popping up from Strategic Reserve is a fairly easy include for some focused anti-tank that your opponent's going to have to think about. Drop Pod Devastators are fairly efficient. Redemptor Dreadnoughts are generally usable enough for holding the battle line. Attack Bikes and Land Speeders with multi-melters are quite nice, plus nice and expendable to put on objectives. Inceptors may have been nerfed since the brief time when the Plasma Exterminators got very cheap, but they're perhaps still worth mentioning in Blood Angels where they get +1 to hit quite easily. And perhaps of particular relevance to Blood Angels compared with most is the Space Marine Whirlwind, not really because of the firepower, but because of the stratagem it can use. It can hand out a 1 command point fights last on one given enemy unit, which can be really important, as Blood Angels don't really have that many easy ways of making enemy units fight last in their Codex. Finally, literally anything that's an assault unit in Codex Space Marines is going to be of interest to the Blood Angels. Out of generic choices, I feel like the assault squads are perhaps particularly interesting for them. Red Thirst really helps out their flurry of Strength 4 attacks. You can take Inferno Pistols and Melter Guns in the Blood Angels version of the assault squad, and they get around quite quickly and are fairly cheap. Quite a nice unit for skirmishing with enemy infantry or jumping around doing actions. Thunderhammer Terminators could be pretty interesting for an Anvil unit, maybe one to hang around with a Sanguinary Priest and get some revivals on the go. They do quite like their 8-inch deep strike charges too. Blade Guard Veterans are fairly efficient with them, again going for a bit more on foot, tough but mighty approach. The Strength 5 swords like the +1 to wound. Vanguard Veterans can be slightly more tanky jump infantry. They get Storm Shields if you want them, so they can be even tankier than Sanguinary Guard for the points. And Aggressors are just generally efficient Space Marine shooting and melee units now. Only 30 points for a flurry of bolt shots plus some combat, hard to go too far wrong. Finally, talking missions and army lists, the Blood Angels do have their own unique secondary objective as well for Arks of Omen missions. This one's called Relentless Assault and is a Battlefield Supremacy one. The idea of this one is that at the end of your turn, you get 4 victory points if there's more Blood Angels units in the enemy deployment zone than there are enemy units in yours. This one will basically compete with behind enemy lines where you just need 2 units in the opponent's deployment zone. For the most part, I'd probably say that you're likely to score a little bit more with this than behind enemy lines, just because it is going to be possible sometimes to score it just with a single unit, maybe a land speeder or something zooming off to do it early in the game. Whether it's actually better or not than the other options in that category will probably depend on your opponent's army though. If they've got units that they can quite happily put in your own deployment zone, then it's going to be worse. And also if they're just a big board control army and you're going to find it hard to get into their deployment zone. It also competes with engage on all fronts and shock tactics as well. Shock tactics being quite good for Blood Angels, killing the enemy off objectives, and that's usually going to be quite in line with their game plan. Otherwise, the generic Space Marine ones are quite nice as well. Oaths of Moment is usually fairly good for scoring at least fairly high. It is quite big whether or not you go first or second though, for putting those units into the centre of the board all exposed. Shock Tactics, as mentioned, is fairly good as well, though Codex Warfare I think is a bit weak unless you're sitting in Devastator Doctrine all game long. Finally, I thought we'd just take a look at the 2 Blood Angels army lists that have won grand tournaments in Arks of Omen, and perhaps unsurprisingly they're both by the same person, Sam Procopio, who's used the boys in red to place first at Toronto Winter Open and then an even bigger tournament called Stud or Snotling. In both cases, the Blood Angels had an Arks of Omen Elites focused detachment, all the better for the more Sanguinary Guard and other tricks there. This one's the first list, which is actually interestingly character light, a Chapter Master with Jump Pack, Relic Blade, Inferno Pistol, with Rites of War and Visage of Death, so he's great on objectives. He also takes the Blood Angels Warlord trait stratagem as well to give him another Warlord trait, so he's got Soul Warden as well for some mortal wound protection. There's then a Sanguinary Priest with the Jump Pack. He's a Chief Apothecary with Selfless Healer for the resurrections, and takes the armor Indomitus for some more protection than he'd normally have. Then the list overall looks really quite fun and diverse. 3 big units of Sanguinary Guard are maybe one of the mainstays. There's a unit of 5, 6, and 7 with a fair mix of fists, swords, and axes. But then there's a whole ton of different other Blood Angels units, plenty of Phobos Marines with 2 Infiltrators and 1 Incursors unit, 3 Aggressors with the Boltstorm Gauntlets, a unit of Scouts and a Landspeeder Storm, which is really quite an efficient little objective snatcher, 5 Assault Marines, including a Lightning Claw and Inferno Pistol, 3 Outriders, 3 Eradicators with Multi-Melter and 2 Heavy Melter Rifles, and 1 big unit of Plasma Inceptors. This was from when they were temporarily super cheap. I guess they would have been hanging around with the Chapter Master for reroll ones. Overall, it's just really cool to see something that's got quite such a big unit diversity doing so well. There's a lot of options here to counter a lot of what the enemy would do. Definitely a whole load of moving parts and options. This guy really does seem to be carrying Blood Angels through the Arks of Omen season so far though. Here's his second list where he used it to take first at the Stud or Snotling tournament, which had over 120 players. Really quite a big achievement there. Interesting to see the differences between the first list and the second. This one we've got a Sanguinary Ancient in. Often it seems that Chapter Master, Sanguinary Priest and Sanguinary Ancient tends to be the core, and some people run more characters besides that. The Ancient picks up the Wrath of Baal for the boosted jump pack range, and the Sanguinary Priest trades out the armor for the Teeth of Terror here to be a bit more of a melee powerhouse. I feel like this one might be a bit more of a refined version of the one above. This time we've got 3 units of 5 Infiltrators with the Gauntlets, a bigger unit of Aggressors with the Boltstorm Gauntlets. In this one we've got a Death Company potential for first turn strike squad with 4 Thunderhammers and 1 with a Power Fist and Inferno Pistol. With Forlorn Fury they could be going bounding forward and smash something important. This time round the Sanguinary Guard have all got maximum Inferno pistols. Maybe a bit of modelling's happened in the meantime. It means that any one of those squads could easily just absolutely total a tank and then charge something different. This time there's 2 different assault squads. One's a unit of 6 and they all take Eviscerators, Melter Guns and a Hammer and Inferno pistol on the Sergeant. That unit of scouts is here again in the Landspeeder Storm, and this time they're backed up by a Whirlwind as well to hand out fights last on the unit that needs it most and ensure that your army is not going to get interrupted critically. Overall looks pretty cool. The Infiltrators will give some pretty nice board control, particularly against armies like Chaos Demons and Genestealer Cults that want to deep strike quite a bit. And then there's a whole load of intensely dangerous infantry units between the Sanguinary Guard, Death Company and Aggressors. It's nice to see that Blood Angels, when played to the top level, can certainly do okay in Arks of Omen. So anyway, there we have it, a bit of an overview of playing Blood Angels in Warhammer 40k currently. Let me know your thoughts or any other insights down in the comments below. I'll be interested to hear what sort of things you're playing in your armies at the moment. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, and if you'd like to check out any other similar ones like this, I've done this for a few other chapters now. I'll leave a link to my overview of the Dark Angels chapter down in the video description. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well. You can find that linked in the video description below, and it is what allows me to keep on making videos like this quite so regularly. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.